We finally have Final Fantasy VII Rebirth confirmed for PC coming on January 23rd. The Steam page is up. The PC system requirements are out. We have confirmation that the PC graphics will be upgraded from the PS5 version, at least improved lighting, enhanced textures and modeling, and DLSS support. No mention of FSR at this point. They do mention DualSense controller support, all of that. But with the PC system requirements, there is a major concern here for a lot of players on older systems. There are no GTX cards supported. If you have a GTX 1080 Ti, too bad. It might be powerful enough to run the game, but RTX cards or later model required. Same thing with AMD. Maybe you have an RX 5700. That's as strong as an RX 6600, but it will not support this game. 6,000 models or later required. What's going on with this? Well, they are mentioning specifically the requirement for graphics cards supporting shader model 6.6 or a later version and OS supporting DirectX 12 Ultimate required. So this is a bit confusing how this is worded, because shader model 6.6, as far as I could tell, double checking this, is supported on GPUs prior to the RTX cards and the RX 6000 series. However, DirectX 12 Ultimate support did begin with the RTX series of cards and AMD's 6000 series of cards. Now, this is not the same thing as saying ray tracing is required, although the cards that support DX12 Ultimate are also the cards that support ray tracing. DX12 Ultimate basically allowed for DXR ray tracing, but also added in variable rate shading, mesh shading, and sampler feedback. So this game must be using some combination of these features. I did look into Digital Foundry's coverage of the PlayStation 5 version of the game to check if the PS5 game was ray traced. But they mentioned it was non-ray traced global illumination. So unless for some reason they switched the PC version over to being entirely ray traced and not having their fallback lighting system that they already developed for the PS5 version, then I don't think that this means that the PC version is requiring ray tracing like Indiana Jones did recently. But apparently it requires that type of GPU for this DX12 Ultimate feature set. That's the only sense I can make out of this requirement, because like I said, I think older cards, at least some of them, did support shader model 6.6. So anyway, but it's weird how this is phrased, because and OS supporting DirectX 12 Ultimate required. Like the operating system supporting DirectX 12 Ultimate, it doesn't specifically say the graphics card needs to support DirectX 12 Ultimate. This is very strangely phrased, but that's the only way we can make sense of this, and this is stated unambiguously. RX 6600 or later, not more powerful, it says or later, meaning RX 6000 series required and RTX series or later model required. So 1080 Ti's, RX 5700 XTs, looking like you're just not going to be able to play this game, and that's disappointing. I'm curious which of these DX12 Ultimate features is the one that's required, or if maybe you'd be unsupported, but maybe you could try to load the game, because this is not the first time we've seen this type of thing, although not stated this strictly, where with Alan Wake 2, for example, mesh shaders, which is a DX12 Ultimate feature, mesh shaders were required for that game, but you could still try to run it on cards without mesh shaders, and the game had some type of a fallback, which I think has been improved since then at post-launch. But anyway, that's the biggest concern I see with this. Now, what are these cards actually getting you? So an RX 6600, an Intel Arc A580, and RTX 2060 are all similarly powerful GPUs, but they're all apparently targeting 30 FPS at 1080p low. However, I have some thoughts on that, because the jump to 1080p 60 FPS medium includes jumping to an RTX 2070. A 2060 to a 2070 is not going to double your frame rate, especially if you're also increasing graphic settings. So, in other words, there's stuff about the system requirement chart that just doesn't make sense. And so this is a game that if you guys show interest, one way I judge interest on if I should benchmark games when they launch is when I cover the PC system requirements charts, if there's a lot of interest in that video, a lot of comments, a lot of views, that kind of thing. So anyway, if there seems to be a lot of interest in this game, I'd like to benchmark this because I want to see what happens if you try to start the game on like a GTX 10 series card or something like that, because this is a very unusual. The only game I can think of that has completely required RX 6000 or RTX 20 series or later has been Indiana Jones, and that's because the game was entirely developed with ray tracing in mind. There was no fallback, and that doesn't appear to be the case here. So anyway, like I said, also, so that doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, the CPUs make more sense, because if you're going from 30 FPS to 60 FPS, it would make sense to have a more powerful CPU required to do that if these lower-end CPUs couldn't get you to 60 FPS. So for 30 FPS, it looks like a Ryzen 5 1400 or a Core i3 8100 should be able to at least play the game at 30 FPS. Will the game be stuttering? Well, this is an Unreal Engine 4 game, so it might be stuttering even on a 9800X 3D. That's just how this engine goes. The previous Final Fantasy VII game with Remake was very stuttery in PC, especially in certain locations. Anyway, so let's talk about these GPUs for a minute and then the step up to the 1080p 60 requirement, because like I said, it doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, grouping this cluster together does make sense, but this jump doesn't. So if we go over to Tech Power-Up's relative performance chart, and I click on one of these, maybe we'll click on the RTX 2060, because I think it's generally the least powerful of the bunch. It's mentioning, the A580 and the RX 6600 in that same chunk of graphics cards. Okay, fine. These are all within about 10% of performance on average, according to Tech Power-Up's relative performance chart. That doesn't mean that's how they'll perform in this particular game, but it's not unreasonable to see these grouped together. What doesn't make sense is the step up to 1080p 60 medium, because if the 2060 is getting you 30 FPS, the 2070 is generally only about 15% more powerful. Let me move my fat head out of the way. About 15% more powerful, 14 here, compared to the 2060. 15% more performance does not take you from 30 FPS to 60 FPS, especially if you're also increasing the graphic settings from low to medium. This doesn't make sense unless they are perhaps abusing upscaling on the system requirement chart without telling us that. And to me, that's the only thing that makes sense. If they're going with this placement, is that maybe the 20, it also gets you more VRAM. Like, we get 2 more gigabytes of VRAM. Does that have something to do with it? In other words, this just doesn't make sense from just a straight up performance scaling. Like, also, the reason why I think they might be having upscaling in mind when they do this is because of these other kind of strange mentions they're saying here. Because in the notes, they're mentioning that GPU memory, so VRAM, of 12 gigabytes or greater recommended if a 4K monitor is used. Now, they place that note 3 times, two times on the chart. But then on this one, it moves up to 16 gigabytes or greater recommended if a 4K monitor is used on the ultra settings. So they are changing that note eventually here at the end. So what exactly are they saying here? Are they saying that you're going to be upscaling from 1080p to 4K and that would require 12 gigabytes of VRAM? But then, the RTX 2060 only has 6 gigabytes of VRAM. So like, there's a lot that just doesn't make sense here. But these notes are specifically saying that 12 gigabyte VRAM cards probably can't play this game at ultra settings at 4K. And they're even saying if a 4K monitor is used, which is not the same thing as saying that you're rendering the game at 4K. Although they are mentioning playing at 4K right here. 2160p is 4K. So that's, again, another really strange thing in the system requirements chart. But it does look like the game is likely to be pretty VRAM hungry based on this, at least at the higher settings. And they do mention enhanced textures. So I'm wondering if they've upgraded the textures compared to the PS5 version. Now, is the improved lighting involving ray tracing? Because if the improved lighting involves ray tracing, is that why we have this requirement? Because the PS5 version didn't have ray tracing, like I said, as far as I was able to research. So much that doesn't make sense here. So again, the jump from the 2060 to the 2070 doesn't make sense for going from 30 to 60. What also doesn't make sense is pairing the 2070 with the 6700 XT. Because if we take a look at that, if I set the 2070 as the baseline, then the 6700 XT is generally 35% more powerful. Like that's a pretty big jump. There's other cards that are much closer in performance to the 2070 from AMD, including something like the RX 6600, which they started in the low requirements, which again doesn't make a lot of sense. Unless perhaps there's ray tracing involved, in which case the 2070 is more competitive with the 6700 XT. But again, the console version of the game doesn't use ray tracing, and nothing here says that ray tracing was added, although it did mention improved lighting. So again, this is kind of a mystery wrapped in an enigma. Or maybe they just randomly threw some GPUs in here, guys. This really doesn't make a lot of sense. Like I said, the CPU jumping up here does make more sense, because going from 30 FPS to 60 FPS makes sense. And this is a game with a 60 FPS mode on PS5. It does dip at times, but is mostly locked to 60 FPS, indicating that the consoles can hit 60 FPS on their CPUs. And they'd be more along the lines of something kind of like a 3700X. Usually maybe a little bit slower, but then again, consoles are generally a bit more optimized, and it works a little differently anyway. So those don't seem completely unreasonable, although it is possible that a lot of people might not have CPUs this powerful, even if they have GPUs this powerful, if you're an older system and upgraded to these graphics cards. So it is something to keep in mind. The memory requirement is just 16 gigabytes across the board. That's system memory, not VRAM. And the SSDs are also kind of big. Now let's look at these ultra settings for 4K 60 at high settings. So at high settings, 4K 60, they're jumping up the CPUs a little bit, but not crazy. They're adding in a few more cores here. The overall performance here should be pretty similar. But the GPUs are jumping all the way up to a 7900 XTX or an RTX 4080. Now those cards, again, are now back kind of in line with each other. Those cards generally do perform similarly when it's not using ray tracing, which again leads credibility to the theory that they're not using ray tracing here, because usually in heavier ray tracing workloads, the 4080 would pull more fully ahead. If we want to look at the jump from a 6700 XT to 7900 XTX, or kind of look at how much more powerful are they asking for here, it is quite a bit. So if we go from the 6700 XT, set that as our baseline on our relative performance chart, and then we go ahead and scroll up to the 7900 XTX, this is more than doubling the performance. So that would make sense to go from 1080p to 4K. It's actually 4 times the pixels, but generally the performance demands don't scale linearly with pixel count. So this does kind of make sense. But again, I'm wondering how much upscaling may be involved in these targets, because the thing about the game that, previous to this one, Final Fantasy VII Remake rather than Rebirth or Integrate Remake, was that game defaulted to using dynamic resolution scaling. I think it was patched later to where you could kind of turn it off, but it was a game that basically kind of forced you into dynamic resolution scaling without telling you, at least when it launched. So that's where I'm a little bit curious if that has something to do with all of this as well. Anyway, unfortunately, unless the developers clarify a bit more about what's going on here, I think that's all I can say about it at this point, is that there's a lot here that doesn't make sense, but they are stating very clearly that a lot of older GPU users are just going to be out of luck here. I'm curious why. Is it that they added in ray tracing and are requiring ray tracing? Is that the improved lighting, variable rate shading, mesh shading, sampler feedback, some combination of those things for DX12 Ultimate? I don't know, guys. We'll have to find out. Like I said, let me know if you're interested in me benchmarking this game when it comes out. I'll definitely be buying it anyway just to play it. Speaking of buying it, though, I will mention one thing I did like. is that it looks like the not only is the game discounted right now, so you can get it for $49 on Steam rather than the full $70. I was a little scared they'd get greedy and launch it at $70. But for $70, if you haven't played the first part of the series with Final Fantasy VII Remake, then you can get the combo bundle for $70, which does seem, so if you want to jump into this one, it would make sense to play the other game first, and you could play that up until January 23rd. So anyway, I like that this bundle deal does, for the full price of the, the PS5 version of the game, when it launched at $70, you're getting the previous game thrown in as well. So that seems pretty good, at least. But like I said, there's a lot of questions about what's going on here. Let me know what you think in the comment section. What's your analysis here? I'm curious your theories. Anyway, hope all of you have an excellent day.